Welcome to the July Liberal Values in Practice panel discussion. This month we're talking about defining patriotism. And the reason that we're talking about this is because we've seen, I think it's really a relatively recent phenomenon where there is this confusion between what patriotism is, what nationalism is. Often they're used synonymously, and often they're used as verbal clubs. So this month, I've invited 3 veterans with me to help explore this issue, suss out some of the nuances in these terms, and to kind of get a better idea of how we have these discussions in the United States. So let me make an introduction of our vets here. We've got Dr. Anton Shufutinsky. Anton came over as an immigrant from the former USSR when he was younger and became a Navy officer. Thank you all for your service. We've got Spencer Case, Army vet. Spencer, also, you are in the process of writing a book on why it's okay to be patriotic. I believe I've got that name okay, or I got that name right. And you are also a philosophy professor. And then we've got our second Army vet. Sorry, Anton, you're outnumbered here, Army to Navy. But we got our second Army vet, Ken Pope, who is the head of academic programs with the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. So the way we usually do our panels is we have questions. We ask the same question of each of our panelists, and then we engage in conversation around that question. But before we get started, I want to let you know with Circle, I know you can watch without signing up. You can't really join the conversation unless you're signed up. So I want to, again, invite anyone who wants to be part of the conversation to join ILV's Circle. And if you want to watch this later, this will be on our YouTube in about 48 hours. Now, we do have someone in the audience here I'd like to bring in as a co-host, one of our ILV dissidents co-hosts, Mike Burke. Mike, welcome. So with that, I'm going to start us with our first question. And our first question really is just, let's start with definitions, right? So how would you define patriotism? And what is your definition of nationalism? Spencer, I'm going to start with you. How do you define patriotism, and what is your definition of nationalism?
So I guess I would say I don't think there's one canonical distinction between nationalism and patriotism. I think people just tend to use this in a stipulative way, right? So one sense of nationalism versus patriotism, it's a difference between what the object of your loyalty is, whether to a country or to a nation. Often these things coincide, but not always. Like there's not a country of Kurdistan, but there is, many people believe, a nation of Kurdistan. So you could just have that distinction. Often, though, some people will distinguish between nationalism and patriotism in a normative way, whereas in a way that like nationalism is a corrupt form or debased form of patriotism. So Orwell had a version of this where he defined nationalism as being especially aggressive and patriotism sort of a more peaceful and less aggressive form of national love. Now, the problem I have with this is that we have other words for the debased form of patriotism. We have the word chauvinism, national chauvinism. We have the word jingoism. We've got all these other words. So I don't think that we should make nationalism do, double or triple duty, meaning this. So that's one thing I would say about that. And the other thing is that a lot of self-identified nationalists would not agree to some of those negative characterizations. As far as defining patriotism positively, this is one thing I want to emphasize. I could really spend a whole hour on this, but I'll just hit on one point, which is that in early definitions of patriotism in the English language, it really entered like political vocabulary in the early parliamentary era with like Bolingbroke's work. And at the time, it was about transcending one's own personal interest or party for the interest of the country. It really didn't have a whole lot to do with foreigners or preferring your own citizens' lives over the lives of foreigners or something like that. And this is actually, I think, consistent with other forms of loyalty. So it has the virtue of, being consistent with other kinds of loyalty we talk about. So I think, Simon Keller has this weird way of defining loyalty. Like, to be loyal to X is to prefer X to other kinds, like to love your brother over other children or something like that. But I think that can't be quite right. Like, I could be alone with my brother on a desert island and I could show loyalty to him. It's not really about prioritizing him over someone else. It's about prioritizing his interests over my own when the two come into conflict, not abandoning him or his interest or giving up on the relationship when the going gets hard. And so I think patriotism should be understood as being like that, but for your country, right? So I don't think it's primarily a matter of prioritizing the lives of your own citizens over other citizens. I think it's more a matter of making sacrifices on behalf of your fellow countrymen, on behalf of your country and its institutions. So I'll begin with that.
Anton, to you. Same question.
Sure. Sure. Thanks. First, let me say, I don't really feel outnumbered. Normally, it takes the two brains of somebody from the Army to meet one brain of someone from the Navy. So we're no, I'm just joking. It's fun banter usually between services. I actually spent a couple years as an Army officer as well. Yeah, let me talk about patriotism a little bit first. I'll start with this. I have a friend of many years, all right, and I spent some time with his family a few years back, and it always comes back to mind when we talk about patriotism, where he said something along the lines of, you'll never meet a family that's more patriotic than mine, right? We're the most patriotic people. Now, I don't doubt for a second that, that they have love for the United States, that they believe it's the greatest country on earth, right? Everything that I know about them, that's who they are, right? But it goes far beyond, patriotism goes far beyond wearing, loving the country and wearing the Star Spangled T-shirt on 4th of July and saying we're patriotic and cheering for the New England Patriots, right? Back, if you think of like Roman antiquity, the word patria, that's kind of the root for patriotism, and it really had to do with a love for common liberty, right, or love for common law and liberty, and beyond that, and more importantly, was the piece that that it's also safeguarded, or that common liberty is safeguarded by the citizenry's civic experience, right? So that's, for me, patriotism is along that line. It's more than love of country. Patriotism is about ensuring that there is a country for future generations to love. Right? There is a loyalty to the country, but it goes beyond just being loyal. It goes towards protecting that, the values, right, and the values of the nation, and protecting that for future generations. No, that comes with a responsibility. For some, that's military service. For others, that's serving in emergency, emergency responders or firefighters or those kind of roles. For others, that's voting and protesting when you see something that's breaking those liberties, right? Those common liberties, and doing what you can to safeguard and protect them. Nationalism very often is conflated with patriotism. I don't believe they are exactly the same thing, but they can certainly overlap, right? Rousseau said something about nationalism like, it is the loyalty to political institutions, right? And that's, to me, that's different than the loyalty to nation. Political institutions could be loyalty to a communist regime, right, or a communist party, or any party, right, any party in the United States or any other group, right? So I do think that nationalism can certainly overlap with patriotism. It can be loyalty to, the government and to the people of the United States, or what other country you may be in, but it can also be the antithesis of patriotism, right? It can be synonymous, can also be the antithesis when that nationalism goes to something that actually moves towards the destruction of those common values and liberties that we talk about.
Thanks, Anton. Ken,
Sure.
finally you.
Yeah, I guess first thing I would just go back to my my Navy partner and say, usually the reason you guys' brains were twice as big is you've been around the reactors too long. But anyway, so I think I think Spencer and Anton both gave very good explanations, definitions of what they think these terms mean, and I think Spencer on this piece, where it seems like patriotism, nationalism are kind of used synonymously now, and they are kind of viewed in some sense as synonyms rather than different pieces of our language. So I just take it a very simple, take on the whole patriotism thing. It's just, to me, it's more of a feeling of affection, love, what, if you will, devotion to your nation, a sense of attachment to your country, something you want to protect, the nation itself, the culture, its history. You're proud of that history. You think there's something admirable about your nation, and you have this profound calling or dedication to it. I think nationalism today seems, if you look at I think the classic term, it's just that you view your nation as something that you want to protect. It's asserting the interests of that nation. You think those are important and you want to protect those. I think we kind of get off track today is it's viewed, I think, in the main today, at least, as the people, not so much by the people who may describe themselves as having that kind of feeling of nationalism. They probably wouldn't think of it as a bad thing. I think it's given a bad name for the other folks who may look at that and kind of label it as something that's more exclusionary or isolationist, or as Spencer said, chauvinistic, or something along those lines. I think that's where we are today. I think the language has been a little bit, corrupted on that. I think some people who both use it in describing themselves don't understand what it really means, and people who are labeling them maybe be using that as a club. I think those are some of the questions we're going to dive into as we go into this, but that's kind of my take on it. I think we've got the definitions kind of, for this group where they are now. So I think the next leg I'm really interested in is how we as we go forward, how it's being used today.
Well, this is going to bring us into our next question, but I do think, and each of you kind of touch on some of the difference between the two, and Mike, jump in here too if you've got questions. But I really do feel, correct me if you're wrong, if you think I'm wrong, but I feel like these two terms have become, in the last, let's say, decade, more and more synonymous. I was reading a couple of pieces today that really talks about the introduction of this idea of America first, and with former President Trump using his term that I am a nationalist, and then he also talked about patriotism. And I think that's where we've seen these two terms kind of become conflated, as Anton said. And so one of the things that we've been seeing lately is these terms have become a dog whistle, if you will. I think they've been used, Ken, as you said, in some ways as a verbal club. So really, my next question to you is so I gave my idea, and Mike, share if you'd like, some of yours, how I think that these two, the history of how they became conflated and where we are at now. I would love to hear from each of you where you think that those two terms have become conflated, and whether or not they've both become a dog whistle. Mike, did you want to add to that?
No, I mean, not necessarily. I mean, the only thing I would, I guess, add is that things are different in the UK, perhaps, as they are in the US. So, when you talk about nationalism, historically, we would have the British Nationalist Party, which was the BNP, which was, a very kind of right-wing, xenophobic party. But then more recently, we have the Scottish Nationalist Party, which is woke. So you know, it can go both ways now. And then you know, Plaid Cymru, the Welsh Nationalist Party, is also woke in the UK. Even Sinn Féin, you know, the Northern Irish nationalist, the Catholic Nationalist Party, is also going down that direction as well. So you know, from a British perspective, nationalist doesn't necessarily mean right wing anymore. It can also mean the opposite of that. I'd also like to add, like, when we talk about patriotism, you know, what patriotism means, it very much depends upon your country. Because if you're a Brit or an American, and you're singing, for example, Land of Hope and Glory, Mother of the Free, that means something, right? You're asserting a key liberal value by saying, you know, we believe Britain to be Mother of the Free. Or the Land of the Free, if you're singing the Star Spangled Banner, which is another key liberal value. So if you're patriotic and you're a Brit or you're American, you really are asserting key liberal values, I think.
So going back, since we've got vets here in the U.S. specifically, and I think that's a really good point, Mike. That, I mean, these ideas actually don't always translate across borders. In the United States specifically, and Spencer, I'll start again with you. What do you think about this classical historical definitions of patriotism and nationalism, and how have they evolved, and where have you seen that transition take place?
I'm not really an expert on that language question. It does seem to me that my intuition is what you've said, that they've become sort of merged in the last 10 years. I think maybe one thing that's happened is just that patriotism has been an overburdened term. So when people want to distinguish themselves, they seek a new term. Patriotism, it's kind of interesting. Patriotism is always sort of had like a right of center valence to it. Like if you ask somebody, what are your politics? And he says, I'm very patriotic. And that's all you knew, you would assume this person was right of center. And liberals have tended to be more suspicious of patriotism generally, but they also don't want to renounce it. They also claim that they're like the true patriots or something like that. But I think in a lot of political discourse and rhetoric, patriotism is used in like an almost deflationary way, where if a politician says that something is patriotic, that just means it's my preferred policy, or it's the policy I think that it's best. It doesn't have a whole lot of content to it. So it could be what's happening is people are just moving to a different term because an old one has been worn out. Maybe the explosion of patriotic rhetoric post 9/11 had something to do with wearing it out. That's just speculation on my part. The whole dog whistle thing is interesting. I will say I generally think that appeals to accusations that something is a dog whistle is poisonous rhetoric. It often involves people making accusations about other people's motives. Usually people know their own motives better than their political opponents do. So I'm generally suspicious of that kind of rhetorical move. But I will say this, there are certain contexts where you would expect people to speak euphemistically because the thing that they do want to say is not socially acceptable. I don't want to deny that phenomenon ever happens. And maybe it is happening with nationalism. There's a book by Eric Kaufman called White Shift. I don't know if you're familiar with it. It's a very interesting book.
It's a great book.
It's a very fascinating book. It changed my mind about a few things. He makes the point that like racial rhetoric and politics in the U.S. has been badly sort of corrupted. And he thinks there was this sort of status quo ante, that's something that made sense about, I don't know, 50, 60 years ago or something, that it made sense that every group except white people in the U.S. could proudly proclaim their ethnic identity and be a little bit ethnocentric within limits, but white people couldn't. because that was an 85% white country, and it seemed a little aggressive, and understandably, given the history and all that. So, but he's saying that as the country changes, that kind of double standard makes less and less sense. People are getting uncomfortable with the idea of being an ethnic minority. And other groups will say join the club, but I mean, it's generally true that like if the Han Chinese were told by their government, hey, you're going to be a minority in China in this century, just get used to the idea, don't complain about it, that's racist, there would be some discomfort with that idea. And so Kaufman says that people have anxieties. A lot of white people have anxieties about this change, but they can't express that. And so they appeal to like economic nationalism, nationalist arguments against immigration, and things that they might actually believe in, but it's not really the motive. And so he actually thinks that we should relax our anti-racist norms a bit to allow people to say what they're really thinking anyway. Like, he just doesn't think that we gain anything by incentivizing people to lie about what they really think. I'll leave it to you whether you think that is a legitimate conclusion to draw from this. But yeah, I think the way that nationalism might be a euphemistic way of referring to certain views or sentiments that are not considered socially acceptable. So I guess I would kind of go along and say it could be a dog whistle, even though I'm generally not comfortable with the rhetorical move of calling things dog whistles. But maybe there is something to it in this case.
Thanks, Spencer. Anton, your thoughts?
Yeah, I guess this has been about 2 decades, maybe 1.5 decades, that I've watched the definition of what nationalism is evolve. Right, I a little bit differently here with regards to patriotism and nationalism. I don't know if I agree that the term patriotism has always been kind of a right of center thing. I served in the military with Democrats, Republicans, independents, and all types of folks for many, many, many years, and I wouldn't say that there was a difference in the belief, at least of that population, with regard to the terminology of patriotism. Nationalism, I think, is a little bit different. And again, when nationalism can exist in many forms, depending on the political institution, again, that you're loyal to, if that's the definition that we go by. And so I've watched the term nationalism become more and more accepted on the right of center and far right of center over time, and to be demonized from left of center and far left of center. And I think it's been intentionally used that way. Not that you couldn't be nationalist if you're far left, right? Obviously, you can be, because that's what we're seeing in many cases today, and on the right. However, it has been, again, conflated, I think, inappropriately with the terminology of nationalism akin to like Nazism, and so it's been slowly used as a form of a trigger for terminology like white supremacy and extremism, right? And so it's become current era, I think, over time, right? Not overnight, a definition of that far right wing extremist group. And while I think the right doesn't see it that way, I think the left does see it that way and tries to use the language in that form. Patriotism, I don't think it's going there, but because it's conflated, I think, with nationalism and synonymous in some ways, there are certainly, I would say, groups that would like to make patriotism a dog whistle, and would like to make it a negative terminology, like the way that they see that they use nationalism now. There are. I don't think it's just a national thing, right? I think there are organizations and groups that are nefarious to the success of the United States, that use whatever means that are necessary in order to want to negate our pride in our country and our understanding and desire for those liberties that we have and that we thrive on, that have made us the country that we are. And it's made us successful and be able to fight together as, you know, as a nation during those you know, tragic and difficult times. And you know, there are certainly organizations out there that want to be able to tear that down, and we see that today. You know, we see a different version of burning flags than we've seen in the past, right? We've seen a different version of replacing our flags and defacing emblems of American patriotism throughout the country. So I definitely think that those desires to break down patriotism that way do exist, and I think it has to do that has a lot to do with some of the reduction of the number of people that are entering our military and our troubles with those kind of in addition to other reasons, right? One of the reasons for our troubles with our recruitment today.
Ken.
Yeah. So is it a dog whistle? I'm not sure. I think what it really, to me, how I tend to view it is I think the problem is that both terms are kind of used as clubs today, kind of used to kind of smack a political opponent or an ideological opponent on a topic they don't particularly agree with them on. And I think it kind of gets, you know, kind of the purpose of what we're talking about today and with ILV is, you know, traditional classical liberal values and free speech is the ability to have a conversation about something without being labeled as something else because it's convenient to the argument's sake. So I think that's what happens with the terms nationalism and patriotism to some degree. So if you think, I mean, Spencer gave a couple examples, Anton did too, but if you think about if you're, let's say this is just one example, if you're from the more conservative point of view and you have a policy disagreement with, say, you know, conversations about NATO or what we're doing in Ukraine or Israel or the border crisis or whatever, I think some groups will then attempt to label you, well, you're a nationalist, and all other things, other terminology that we tend to throw at each other when we don't agree on something. So I think that really, to me, it's more the language, you know, writ large is being used as a club, and it's instead of having a discussion about, you know, the virtue of a policy. I think Spencer hit on that. Is what did the person really say? What's the real policy? Can you find that in a policy document per se, as opposed to listening to what, you know, somebody's description of that policy may be, or what they think that person may be now because of something he espoused. And it's like we're getting away from critical thinking about a lot of issues because of that. We don't think about things. You know, you could have the laundry list. We could take each one of the examples I gave, and we could have some pretty robust conversations about, you know, what we're doing in some of these areas and why. And there's nothing wrong with having the conversation. And you know, first way to end a conversation is to demonize your opponent and not even let the conversation begin. And I think that's what we've got to really get away from.
Can I follow up on a couple of those things?
Please.
So about the verbal club thing, patriotism's heyday of being a verbal club, I think, might be in the past, or at least it might be in a lull right now. And it does. And when something was called unpatriotic, it generally seems like that way of demonizing something would come from the right, not the left.
But let me just clarify then, because really the one I'm going after is nationalism more than anything else. That's the one I'm thinking of today.
That's fine. I'm just adding to what you're saying without disagreeing. It seems like now if somebody from the right is going to condemn somebody from the left, like that's some woke critical theory bullshit or something like that. They're not going to call it unpatriotic. At least I haven't heard that terminology. And from the left, they're going to say it's racist or something like that. It seems like the rhetoric of patriotism doesn't have the same purchase that it once had. That's just my impression. What do you think about that?
I agree with that statement. I think that's well said. I think where I see most of it is it's targeting foreign policy disagreements with the term nationalism when you don't agree with a certain aspect of a the policy. Now, again, for any one of the examples, that NATO, conversations about NATO, conversations about Ukraine or Israel or border or whatever, then if you feel a certain way about it or you espouse a certain view, then you're a nationalist. Therefore, you must be a fascist, and the laundry list of the snowballing effect of demonizing the term, and it goes the other way as well.
Can I make an observation that would get me labelled as a fascist? And I think unfairly so. I hate London, right? I don't know if you've ever been to London, any of you. Like London is amazing on so many levels. If you like restaurants, if you like bars, if you like museums, art galleries, and all that stuff, it's an absolutely wonderful city. But there are no English people there, and whenever I'm in London, I feel deeply, deeply, deeply uncomfortable. In a way, for example, I don't feel when I'm in Tokyo, right? So when I'm in Tokyo, it's a Japanese city. I know what I'm going to get. In London, I feel uncomfortable all of the time. It's because it's a completely unpredictable city. There is nothing English about it anymore, apart from the historical landmarks. And I feel that one observation that we're not allowed to make, that I think many of us feel, and one that is unfairly impugned, is that it's okay to have a sense of familiarity and a liking and even a longing for where you've come from and the people that you've grown up around, not because you dislike other people automatically, but because there is a sense of predictability. If you know that you grew up in a certain area or you know that you grew up in a certain country, you can reasonably assume that the other people who have grown up around you are going to have similar values to your own. Again, and we know what they are if you're going to sing the Star Spangled Banner or Land of Hope and Glory. This emphasis on liberal values and freedom. Whereas in London, with mass immigration, there are people who have come from Islamic countries who have grown up with very, very different values to your own. Many of whom have integrated, and that's great, but many of whom haven't. And I feel that kind of observation, one that I just made, is one that is impugned all of the time as being racist or fascist. Even though the English haven't been an ethnicity for, God knows how long. I mean, Spencer, for example, and I are a fan of an Irish philosopher called Edmund Burke, who defined English in the 18th century and became English, and he was Irish. But these kinds of sentiments we're not allowed to make, and I find that deeply problematic.
Mike, that's really interesting because I was writing as I was doing some research on this. Like, it's really very difficult, I feel like, to define nationalism and patriotism in such diverse countries like America, and you were just mentioning London and in the UK. I'm going to put a finer point on how I see kind of the terms and the differences. With nationalism, I see the nation is greater than the individual. And I see nationalism as more of like a tribalism versus patriotism being a love of country. So nation, I mean, and I think there the difference is the definition of nation and country. So a nation doesn't have to be a country, right? So patriotism is love of country. Nation is love is love of an identity group. And I think that's where the difference is. And so I think, touching on what you said, in a country that is so diverse, nationalism can, if you define it the way I just did, can be a damaging ideology. Any other?
Sure. I mean, and that's kind of what I was getting to, Jen, is earlier, is that you can be a nationalist for any particular group, right? Any particular nation, any group, any political movement, society or institution, and so therefore it translates everywhere, right? But it can be either something that's benign, it can be something that's positive, and it can be also something that's harmful, right? And that's where I was stating that yes, it can very well overlap with patriotism, and it can completely confound it.
But I would just say, at least in the case of the U.S., if you what was kind of our founding vision was, we're going to we're the melting pot. Everybody comes here to be an American, not to be something else plus an American. I think that was the, kind of the beauty of what we had. And I think, if your form of nationalism kind of celebrates that aspect, we're a melting pot, we're, everybody has the same rights, we're all equal, we're here together to be an American. I think that's a good form of that. If it's becoming tribal, then I don't know that that's really nationalism anymore. That's more like, I would just call it it's called balkanization, from what I saw during my time in the Balkans. It didn't work real well when we take that path with it. So I think that's just, I don't know how you really describe that. I mean, what I saw was the tribe first, the clan first, the family first, and it was not, the sense of a nation. That's why I think we've had such problems in trying to build a nation, if you will, in Afghanistan or Iraq, because that's not their tradition. And that's why it didn't really work that well in either case for us. We tried to build something that nobody had a notion of.
But I think you just defined kind of the difference, though, between patriotism and nationalism in a way. And Spencer, to Eric Kaufman's book White Shift, I think that's, if I remember his argument right, one of the things that he was making I think a case for was to have this overarching national identity, and that national identity being a love for country, being a love for the American experiment, being a love for our common history, without that is so diverse. And I think that would be defined as patriotism. And it's when we get to where we see so much polarization in the United States now. And I think this is where we've come up with this disagreement between what nationalism and patriotism is. And I think part of that polarization is a result of these tribal identities.
Arthur Schlesinger Jr., at the end of his career, he was one of a number of different left-leaning intellectuals who were making similar points in the 90s. So they began to be uncomfortable with the left's attitudes towards patriotism. And one of the things that Schlesinger says in the book, The Disuniting of America, he says the issue of the 21st century is going to be what holds a nation together. Mm. Because I think we've been kind of complacent about this. Yeah. Maybe especially in the United States, we've been complacent about this. I think people seem to believe that this robust sense of Americanness is just going to spontaneously emerge no matter what happens. There's this robust sense of Americanness that's going to emerge. And after all, you can point to examples of all of the immigration waves that the nation has successfully digested, assimilated, made it part of its own thing. But I do think that people get a little carried away where they think that, we shouldn't have, I have heard people say this isn't a straw man. This isn't what everybody thinks, but, we can just let whoever wants to come here, and they'll just be Americans, because the Americans will just be whoever sorts themselves here, on their own. And there's nothing actively we need to do to make sure that this happens at a rate at which, there's a stable sense of national identity. Because I think the worry, or one of my really big worries, is that countries will fragment when this psychological sense of usness can no longer sustain the changes that are happening. Like Orwell in Notes on Nationalism. No, it's England, Your England, I think, or England, Our England. I can't remember the title, but in one of those essays, he just mentions all of this collection of small familiar things that remind him of home and that he's home. One of the things was like the weight of the coins or something like that, the pound sterling at the time. And of course, like, England would still be England if that goes away. There's nothing essential about it. But if enough changes happen rapidly enough, there's no sense of home. And this is really unsettling to people. And I think a lot of liberal, even classical liberal, not just like American lingo for left wing, liberal thought doesn't always seem to address this head on. This, like, a rights-based framework doesn't necessarily capture this, unless you want to say there's like a right to culture or a right to a sense of home or something like that. I remember, Mike, you might remember this. There was some video about what is British culture, and it had a very London 2018 kind of idea of what this was. And it's like they had a picture of a bus, and everyone, the little voice box is showing everyone saying hello in a different language. And they're like, well, what is Britain really? We don't know. Nothing is really ours. And it had like the YouTube like to dislike ratio was like 10-1. Like people hated it.
Of
And
course.
and I can understand that. So in a sense, I want to say, like, there is something in the psychology of most human beings that does yearn for some kind of tribalism. And yeah, and I think if we don't acknowledge that and we don't try to channel that into healthy and constructive forms, it's going to take on unhealthy forms. In the same way, like, if you don't allow, I would make a very close analogy here with the right to property. Like, people are self-interested. If you allow them to make money on the free market, owning a business or whatever, then their self-interest can be channeled in that way. If the only way to realize self-interest is through being a warlord or something, then it's going to turn into something much worse. You see what I mean?
I completely see what you mean, Spencer, and you know, this is really getting to my experience in London. I mean, I just don't recognize it as being anything as a part of us anymore. You know, to the point where people can't even speak the language. I watched a video recently of a Japanese man, middle-aged Japanese man, and he's on holiday in London. It was a real YouTube video. You can probably find it if you look for it. And he's told that the British are only 34% of the population of London, and he's completely, like, knocked for six. He's like, and then somebody says, well, how would you feel if that was Tokyo? And he's automatically responds as a matter of course, well, that would be an extremely bad thing. You know, so diversity is a really great thing. I mean, I think that most English people would agree that if you have an Indian family that moves in, and maybe they open up a restaurant and they start introducing new cuisine, and you know, and they go through and integrate into the community, then that's a great thing. And I would agree with that. But once you start to have what has happened, for example, in cities in the UK like Bradford, wherein the native population has completely moved out, and it's become a foreign city. You know, again, very British style housing, but different food, different languages, different ethnicities, different religions, and completely balkanized, as Ken would say, as opposed to Americanized, in which, you know, it is kind of digested and assimilated. Then that becomes a very negative thing. And I worry that by expressing the kind of view that I've just expressed, I am unfairly labeled as being a fascist or a racist or something like that. Whereas somebody in Pakistan who would express exactly the same view, it would be, you know, regarded as completely okay.
Well, you just said something, Mike, that I want to go back to something you were saying earlier, how patriotism and nationalism is seen in different countries. And Spencer, I'm not sorry, Spencer, Anton, I wanted to direct this to you. I mean, as someone who came over as a, former Soviet Union immigrant, and then ended up joining, the American military. And I know that you still have some ties back to Russia. How do they define differently this idea of patriotism and nationalism? And does it matter? But I guess start with when we're looking at this Russia.
Yeah, so I guess it depends on the country, but I do still think that nationalism translates everywhere, because it's all about loyalty to any particular group or society. In authoritarian countries such as the Soviet Union when it existed, or North Korea or Iran today, right? We have very much a different situation of what patriotism and nationalism might be I think they're forced, right? Historically, especially in the Soviet Union, they're forced, driven by fear, right? Wearing party pins with, Lenin and Stalin on them, and being official members of the party, or you're not part of the club. And like I remember, I was very little, I was a very young child, and remember, my brother coming home from school, and he was in essentially what would be first grade, and his hand was all red, and he was crying because he got beaten on a hand with a ruler by his teacher because he was trying to write with his left hand, right? So it's that kind of, we're gonna force you into doing things the way that we believe it needs to be done, and that's what patriotism is in those kind of places. That only lasts so long. I think history kind of shows that, be it 5 months or 5 years or 70 years, right? It'll eventually collapse because it's false patriotism. It's false loyalty, right? The great majority of the population is not truly patriotic for those ideals because they're not common liberties, right? They're not things that majority of the population wants. It's fostered through fear. Yeah, I mean, I want to go back to what Spencer was saying a moment ago, a few minutes ago, was that I do agree that there's this, kind of the fervor of patriotism in the United States has I think floated off some, and we do kind of expect this, based on historic events, that we're going to have this spontaneous generation of a patriotic response to anything, that happens to our country here, or in the United States. But the reality is that historically what we had as patriotism, as Spencer said, I think it was Spencer that said that notion of patriotism is kind of at a lull right now. Was based, I think, on this type of way that we lived and learned, right? We said the Pledge of Allegiance, and we we watched the space shuttle take off as a nation, and we learned civics in school, right? I remember having to learn. I didn't even have to take the test. My parents took the test for citizenship, but I remember having to learn it, right? And learning it and going to school and being so happy because I knew it, and there were a bunch of kids that were not immigrants that did not. Right, but that was a a feeling of connection to the land and to the people, and patriotism to the American values, right? The liberal values that we talk about of freedom of speech and religion and press and common equal treatment under the law and pursuit of happiness and those kind of things, right? But we don't have that same kind of environment today. Right, those things are not only not learned. In some cases, they're ostracized, and so we have a very different environment. Kurt Lewin wrote back in 1946 or 47 about Israel. He was coming from Kurt Lewin was a father of modern social psychology, and kind of the father of other fields like organization behavior and organization development. And he wrote about Israel. He wrote about children in the United States. Right, that those that felt a connection to their Jewishness and to Israel, versus those that didn't, had a very different kind of experience and success in school and a very different view of themselves and their level of confidence, right? And that had to do with kind of embracing that connection to their land and to their indigenous homeland, or versus not, because they were being criticized or bullied, and he showed psychologically a very different response, right? And the same goes with I think what we're seeing today is when you have those kind of connections, what we just talked about, and you have that civic education, and then you have a very different way of seeing things, and there's more, I think, a more pragmatic approach to whatever social situations are you're undergoing in a different way to be able to deal with them and to have discourse and rather than just debate, right? Whereas where we don't have that, we get in these situations of not the tribalism that can be used in a positive way, but the kind of tribalism that's used in a very uh, it could even be violently, right?
And
And so yeah,
we're seeing that in the United States at the moment in a way that I never thought in my lifetime that
absolutely.
we'd see. So, like when I was a kid and in the UK, and I was looking in America, I would roll my eyes at you guys with all your Star Spangled Banners and your flags, and I just think, oh, for fuck's sake, what are they up to? It was ridiculous to me, you know. But I've watched you lose that, and now, you know, as a 42-year-old, I realized that what you had, as weird as I may have thought of it, was so much better than what you have right now. You've really lost something. Um, to the extent where somebody can go up to national monuments, and I'm not talking about Dixie Generals, by the way, you know, Abraham Lincoln, and recently in Washington DC, I think people were spray painting Hamas, you know, on national monuments,
Well, the
and
latest is Hamas is coming. That was in DC just this week. So, yeah.
but that's disgusting. I mean, you know, forget about. I mean, could you could you name a more anti, not even un-American? Could you name a more anti-American organization than Hamas? And yet you're going to spray that on a national monument, and you're going to tear down an American flag that is, you know, if you want to buy an American flag and burn it, you know, you can say I would say that's a very bad thing to do, but you know, that's protected speech. But you weren't buying an American flag, you're stealing an American flag and burning it and spraying Hamas on a national monument. And this wasn't just immigrants that were doing this. I'm sure there were some immigrants that were doing it, but that was natural born American citizens. And you can see them speaking in perfect American accents. How are we at this stage? We get it that, you know, nationalism can be a bad thing, right? Fine, we understand that. Everybody understands that. But this is at least as bad, if not worse. How are we here? You know, and how do we get back to a sense where we realize the reality, which is that America and the UK, for example, are right now and have been for the vast majority of their existence profound forces for good in the world, and Israel too, by the way.
It sounds like, I mean, from what I hear you saying and from what I'm seeing, Mike, is that the new patriotism is anti-patriotism in a way,
Right.
you know, and that is frightening. So that brings us actually to one of the big questions here. I mean, is patriotism necessary to hold a country together? Do we need patriotism? Let's we'll throw nationalism away. We kind of defined that already and whatever. But do we need patriotism?
Yes. Yeah. So I think what we just discussed is the problem is we've taught the opposite in our schools of patriotism, and you know, I think all of us in the military, we remember some of the rituals that we did to build pride in your unit or your ship. If you were in the Navy or whatever, you look back at those and you think they were kind of silly, but you realize the importance now, because you see the same thing playing out in our culture is when you don't, you know, teach kids to be patriotic, and if you don't cultivate that in the people aspiring to be citizens in our nation, then it's not a surprise that you have what we're having now. We've been teaching the exact opposite of patriotism. We've been teaching that we are by nature a racist, terrible, horrendous country. You know, in the position I'm in now, I get to look at a lot of K through 12 academic standards across the U.S., different states. That's what I see, is a lot of that. I don't see any of the patriotic stuff anymore. I see a lot of the other stuff, teaching them that we are the problem. So to me, it's not a huge shock, other than seeing it, Hamas and other people spray painting garbage, stealing flags to burn them, and all the other stuff that we see. So I think that's what it is. We don't teach it any longer. And
Yeah, I do think that that's a certain segment of the population, and they're very loud. and so we see them, but it's increasing, and yes, we go back to the teaching, right? We're seeing this in K through 12 schools, but that's, Brandy talks about this all the time. My wife Brandy, that Jen knows well, and it doesn't originate in K through 12 schools, right? The teachers are getting an education somewhere. They're getting it at the schools of education, at universities. They're coming back to K through 12 schools, and they're teaching ideology, and they're no longer teaching from the perspective of critical thinking and analytical thinking. They're teaching from the perspective of trying to push their own perspective. So they're teaching an ideology that all the students are hearing is this is what's right, and something else is wrong. And so when you're doing that, you don't give the student the opportunity to make up their own minds about, you're not just playing devil's advocate, right? And the student can make up their own mind of what's right and what's wrong. At that point they are specifically, it's kind of an overused and demonized word now, but it is indoctrination when you're only looking at things from one perspective, right? And so that doesn't allow for critical analytical thinking of people. And so kids are growing up because this is how they're taught from kindergarten through 12th grade, and then they're going to college where they're getting a lot of the same in some universities and programs, depending.
And I think to kind of complete the circle, Anton, what we're seeing, I said I'd throw away nationalism, but I'm going to bring it back. The problem that we have with conflating patriotism and nationalism of being the same is that patriotism is bad. And so I think that's also something that's being kind of taught, to your point, in our schools, because patriotism and nationalism are the same. Patriotism is bad. America is bad. I think that's kind of the transition we're seeing. And Spencer, I know that your time is limited here. I wanted to go to you. You have a book coming out that says it's okay to be patriotic. Tell us more. I mean, we're saying it doesn't seem like the message that we're getting, at least in America right now, is that it is okay to be patriotic. Maybe it's because of that conflation with nationalism. But how do we bring that back if what we're all saying here is that we need patriotism to survive as a robust country?
Yeah, how do we bring that back? I haven't got to that part of the book yet. Ask me in a year, and by the grace of God, maybe I'll have an explanation for you. I do want to say, though, I think part of what's got us onto this current path is a kind of an overcorrection. We looked at the excesses of like nationalistic zeal or national chauvinism or whatever you want to call it, and we need to dial that back some. This has happened with a bunch of other things too. I think it's happened with sexism and racism as well. But I think we've got to a place where we're so worried about the excesses of patriotism that we haven't really comprehended like the danger of being insufficiently patriotic. It takes a lot of work to explain that to people. So, for example, why should you accept the results of an election? Why should you do that? Well, because we all have the same identity. We have the same values. We value the system more than the party. I agree with what Anton was saying. I think it's the very worst kind of patriotism you can have. So-called, I'm not even sure it should be dignified with the name, but the worst kind of so-called patriotism is where the loyalty to the country is collapsed with whoever's in charge. It's loyalty to the man, loyalty to his party, and then there's nothing above the leader that the leader is supposed to serve. The leader is the apex of the pyramid, and that's it. I think we need to have just a realization that in order for the things that we value to continue operating, we have to have a sense of shared identity. This isn't just some sentimental fluff that's heaped on top. I mean, there are sentimental, superficial expressions of it. There's, fireworks on the 4th of July and T-shirts and that sort of stuff with the American flag or whatever. And you can kind of roll your eyes at that. But, lots of forms of love have sort of I don't know, gooey or silly kinds of expressions that are serious, you know. And so I think we should go back and um, reflect on the question that Schlesinger raises of what holds a country together. And the one thing we definitely need to keep in mind is that this is not something that we can just assume is going to happen, that this is just um, that our identity continues is this natural law of the universe that we can therefore neglect because don't worry, you know, it's always worked in the past. While it's as Anton says, it's a loud minority of people who will actually deface a Lincoln monument by writing Hamas on it. It's a somewhat larger group of people who don't really feel all that outraged about that, or don't, or will say, "Why are you concerned about things rather than human lives?" In this absurd false dichotomy, like you can obviously care about both. I think we ought to be part of being patriotic in a serious way, is we should expect to have some emotional investment in symbols of patriotism. And if we don't, if we shrug when a national monument is defaced and say, well, it's just a piece of stone anyway, it's nothing to me, you know, what's the stock market like today? That is a real problem, and that will issue in serious consequences in the long run, because you need, for the system to function, you need people to understand that we're all in this together in some sense.
Yeah, I was just thinking as you're speaking to Spencer, something, Anton, that you said, and patriotism is so important to a country's survival that so many countries like the Irans, North Koreas, and Russias actually engage in a false patriotism when there is not a patriotism there, like a forced patriotism that you mentioned before. Obviously, we don't want a forced patriotism, but no patriotism at all also will crumble in on itself.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, I mean, we're here talking on the Institute for Liberal Values, right? And to me, liberal values are American values, right? Again, some of those things you mentioned earlier, the freedom of speech and due process and equality under the law and pursuit of happiness, right? Patriotism, again, is about safeguarding those common liberties. And so without it, I mean, you know, you can't be anti-patriotic and still talk about being a liberal, right? Because it's not possible, because we're trying to protect these common liberties and trying to make sure that they exist for the generations of the future. And we don't get that with I mean, we don't get it for long enough, I think, with a forced patriotism. And we can't do away with it if we want to continue to have a nation that's actually free. It's quite paradoxical, actually, right? When you see people that will protest under the freedoms that are provided to them by this country against the very things that allows them to actually protest, right? It's quite baffling. It's easy to, it's easy to demonstrate for, and cheer for and talk about communism and Marxism in a capitalist, democratic republic, right? Try that elsewhere. See what happens, right? So there are those protections that are, I would say our patriotism is aligned with, and it is those common liberties that actually allows people to undertake those kind of tribal actions, even.
Without a shared sense of identity and a sense of duty and of bonds, people like to talk about rights all of the time, but I think duties are more important, and our duties to one another, which is framed by this shared sense of identity. All of these lovely rights and all of the things and all that we enjoy, the nice things that we enjoy, whether we're in the UK or Ireland or any other liberal democracy, are essentially meaningless, because what sustains them fundamentally is that shared sense of identity, that duty that we have to one another. And when people are happy to deface monuments, And people aren't outraged at that, as Spencer said, because the biggest problem is not the people who are defacing it; it's the people who are kind of just go, "Oh well, whatever." Then that shared sense of identity is under threat. That fundamental who we are as a people is really, really, really under threat. And if that goes away, all of the nice things, all of the other rights, all of the other liberal values, whether they're enshrined in the Constitution or not, are done. And that's what I think is at risk if we lose patriotism.
Mike,
One
thank
last
you.
remark.
Yes.
Okay,
Go
I'll
ahead.
just say, if I can bring the point home to people who this hasn't been resonating with, consider the word democracy. A lot of the people who don't like patriotism like the idea of democracy. Well, there has to be a demos. There has to be a people. The we the people has to have some referent. And I don't think it can be entirely nominal, just whoever we say. There has to be a felt sense. And that I think is the thing that we need for the rest of it to work, as Mike says. And I don't know that you necessarily need to be patriotic to sustain that, but you need to be in a collective where there are people who care about that identity enough that they're willing to make sacrifices on what they perceive to be the national good.
And on that note, you three, thank you very much for your service and for the time here today.